Welcome to episode 32 of the Rescued by Dragons fantasy podcast, Tales of the Brunch Club. My name is Brian Messmer, and I am not only your storyteller, but the dungeon master behind the homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign this story is based on. Please join me as I tell the tale of how my players and the dice ruined and improved my perfectly laid plans. But first, a quick recap. In episode 31, the Brunch Club enjoyed a delicious breakfast at a small tavern. They raised a glass to the fallen Vorjon. As they were leaving, the halfling who had been serving them asked for their assistance. He introduced himself as Jory, a cook and master mead maker. He told them he had been kidnapped by pirates. During his escape, he stole a map to the lost treasure of Bon Lodir. The pirates were looking for him, and he needed their protection. They told him they would think about it and would meet him the next morning to let him know their decision. And now, episode 32, The Brunch Club Goes LARPing. The Shivering Nip Tavern was empty when the Brunch Club walked in. They sat at the table they used the day before and waited for Jory. A dwarf with a sullen expression on his face approached their table. "What can I get y'all?" he asked them. They had the sense he wasn't used to greeting the customers, but was doing his best. "Where's Jory?" asked Drusilla. The dwarf snorted. "I fired him. He took off yesterday, right in the middle of his shift." He was visibly annoyed. "Fucking halflings," he then added under his breath. His eyes betrayed a sudden panic when he noticed Salis, but he relaxed when he realized she was a gnome. They ordered brunch and mead from the dwarf. When their meal arrived, they were disappointed. It tasted bland and mediocre. Jory must have been the cook, Tase guessed. Fortunately, the bottled mead was still good. "Hey guys," a familiar voice called out to them. They turned to see a halfling running toward them. He was wearing a short cloak with a hood pulled down to hide his face, but they knew it was Jory. "Sorry, I couldn't meet you," Jory apologized. "I got fired." "We heard," Salis said sympathetically. "So, did you make a decision? Can I join your group? Well, not join, but hang out with you for your protection?" the halfling asked eagerly. They looked awkwardly at each other for a few moments. "We kind of forgot to talk about it," Alora admitted. "We had a lot on our minds," said Salis. That's okay, I understand," Jory said softly. He was unable to mask his disappointment. "Tell you what, Jory, why don't you spend the day with us? That way we'll be able to see if you fit in," suggested Drusilla. "If we do take you under our protection, you'll have to do all the cooking and cleaning, though, since you can't pay us," said Alora. "Well, I'm going to give you a treasure map, but I was probably going to cook for you anyway, so sure," Jory agreed, with some apprehension. "And whenever you introduce yourself, you have to tell people you spell your name Jory, Jorie, with a heart over the I," added Drusilla. That's not how I spell it," Jory said. "Jory, with a heart. That's your new name," repeated Drusilla. "Wow, I guess they were right. Vorjon was the nice one," Jory muttered under his breath. An awkward silence fell over the group. No one was sure what they should do next. Guys," Salis finally said, "I could use some new clothes." They suddenly realized that Salis had been wearing nothing but Alora's winter wolf cloak and the silver boots for 2 days now. "I grew up here. I know just where to go," said Jory, happy to be helpful. Salis found a new robe that was her size, and close to the same color purple as her old one. She bought a new dagger, staff, bedroll, and other supplies that a wandering adventurer might need. She also bought another scroll of Find Familiar to resurrect Pip with. The rest of them pooled their remaining gold to get her a new health potion as well. On their way out of the potion shop, Salis ran up to a bulletin board. "Guys, look at this!" she called to them. They saw a wanted poster depicting a man in wizard robes. He had a long beard and matching eyebrows. His nose was long and hooked. His small eyes were set narrowly together. The poster read, "Wanted, Mage College President Cormier for conspiracy to murder his predecessor through the well-known assassin Varjo." As the group inspected the unflattering portrait of Cormier, Tase noticed the poster below it. "I think I found a way to replace some of our gold," she said, pointing to the bulletin. "The Cell Sun's annual pit fighting tournament," the headline said. Accepting all comers, 10 gold entry fee, 500 gold grand prize, no magic users. It starts in an hour, Tase noticed. Well, that's lucky, observed Salus. It wasn't so much luck as last-minute plot device placed by the dungeon master to move the plot along, since the players couldn't figure out what to do next. Captain Prinold was at the registration table when they arrived. He grinned when he saw them. Well, if it isn't the giant dick killers, he greeted them, laughing at his own joke. Where's the Dragonborn? He'd be a great entry for the tournament. Vorjan's no longer with us, Salus said softly. The smile faded from Prinold's face. He assumed a proper and official tone of voice. I'm sorry to hear that. I liked him. Seemed like a kind and just paladin, he said with respect. He paused for a moment, then asked if any of them were there to sign up for the tournament. How does it work? Asked Tase. Prinold explained that it was a bracket format, with the first round opponents being chosen at random. Wooden weapons were supplied by the Cell Sons. The fight ended when one person was either knocked unconscious or submitted. Headshots to opponents without helmets were frowned upon, but not necessarily cause for disqualification. Tase entered and chose 2 wooden hand axes as her weapons. Laura entered when she noticed wooden arrows were included in the provided arsenal. We'd like to enter one more, Drusilla said. Sorry, no magic users, Prinold reminded her. Oh, no, not me. Put down Jory with a heart and an IE. Wait, what? Jory said, interrupting Drusilla. Drusilla continued as though she didn't hear him. Jory, Jorie, with a heart over the I. Prinold raised an eyebrow and looked down at the halfling. Kind of a downgrade from Vorjan, isn't he? That's what we're here to find out, Drusilla said coldly. Prinold shrugged and entered their names as Drusilla paid him the 30 gold entry fee. They waited to see who their first opponents would be. The Brunch Club watched from a rickety set of wooden bleachers as the first contestants entered the sandpit. The first was a large man who looked even larger in his head-to-toe plate armor. He wielded his wooden two-handed greatsword with ease. Even though the sword was made of wood, his opponent, a younger man in his 20s, looked afraid of getting hit by it. The armored man seemed to be a crowd favorite, judging by the volume of the cheers when he swung his sword into the stomach of the younger man, lifting him off the ground. The uniformed soldiers who were dispersed through the crowd also cheered. The Brunch Club guessed correctly that the armored behemoth was also a Cell Son. The young man had caught his breath and circled the Cell Son. He looked for an opening in the armor, but found none. The larger fighter swung his sword again, catching his opponent under the arm. The crowd paused their cheering for a brief second as they heard the sickening crack of several ribs. The crowd erupted in cheers as the young fighter fell to his knees and raised his hands in submission. The Cell Son pumped his fist in the air in triumph and pointed at some of his soldier friends in the crowd. He offered his hand to his opponent and helped him to his feet. Tase was up next. She faced off against a large, well-armored opponent. This adversary was not as large or heavily armored as the victorious Cell Son, though he did have a shield. Tase had trouble landing effective blows with her wooden hand axes. She was able to dodge many of the swings he took with his wooden saber, but the ones that did hit were leaving her bruised and in pain. Up until now, every time she fought, she could use her companions as a distraction or sneak attack from the shadows. Having to fight an opponent one-on-one in an open arena did not play to her strengths. She felt frustrated. She could hear the Brunch Club cheer her on. Jory cheered the loudest. She refused to give up, but swinging her axes repeatedly against the armor and shield without doing anything was tiring her out. Her opponent was finding it easier to hit her as she grew exhausted. Eventually, her body ached and her lungs burned to the point where she simply couldn't stand anymore. She reluctantly yielded. Her opponent gave her a respectful nod before acknowledging the applause of the crowd. Tase got up and brushed herself off. She walked back to her friends, her head hanging with shame. Her friends greeted her warmly and told her she'd do better next time and she had nothing to be ashamed of. And she really didn't have anything to be ashamed of. This was actually Bethany the player's first time playing a rogue, and also her first time playing Dungeons & Dragons. So she didn't have the experience on one-on-one combat and kind of thinking outside the box and creatively, and everyone's first duel is a difficult feat to accomplish, so she did great. Allure was invited into the pit next. She stood waiting for her opponent, who was taking his time getting there. She inspected the arrows she selected and knocked one onto her bowstring. These arrows had the sharp tips removed and their ends dipped in tar. and cooled over and over again. This created a large, mostly non-lethal bulb at the end. Alora looked up when she heard the squeals of teenage girls and excited applause as a young, handsome, physically fit male walked into the pit. He smiled a wide, toothy grin and winked at the group of young ladies who cheered for him. He wore leather sandals with wide straps, a fur loincloth held up by a thick leather belt around his waist, and nothing else. He held a shield in one hand and a wooden broadsword in the other. He flexed his muscles to the delight of his adoring fans, and then turned to Alora. He winked at her. "Hey there, what's a pretty little thing like you doing in a pit like this?" Alora rolled her eyes. Pernald gave the signal to start the fight. "Don't worry, honey, I'll go easy on you," the cocky young man said. He turned slightly to wink at his fans once more. That's when Alora hit him with an arrow right below the sternum. It knocked the wind out of him and caused him to bend over. Alora fired another arrow. This one hit him square in the top of the collarbone, where there was no fat or muscle to absorb the blow. He screamed in pain. The boyish, smarmy grin was replaced by an angry snarl as he charged at Alora. She sidestepped his clumsy charge and put a few paces between them before shooting an arrow into the small of his back. He screamed again and dropped to his knees. When he looked up, Alora was 6 feet away from him with her bow drawn, an arrow aimed at his forehead. "You should worry, honey. I won't go easy on you," Alora said softly. He held up both hands in submission. The crowd rose to their feet cheering, except for a small group of sullen-looking young ladies who pushed in front of each other, each hoping to be the first to help heal the young man's wounded pride. Jory stood up when his name was called. "Didn't you pick any weapons?" Salas asked. "I've never used weapons before," Jory said. He shrugged and entered the pit. His opponent was an older man. He was once a soldier in his prime and wanted to see if he still had his fighting form. He wielded a short sword in each hand. They circled each other. Jory took a swig of mead from his Boda bag, then assumed a defensive stance as the man lunged at him. Jory evaded both attacks and punched the man squarely in the testicles. "Sorry, that's as high as I can reach," Jory apologized to the man, who was doubled over in pain. The man straightened up and made another attempt to hit Jory, but once again failed to connect with the elusive halfling. Jory reached as high as he could and punched the man in the stomach. He flipped his leg up to try and kick him in the chest and push him back, but accidentally hit the man's head as he was bending forward from the stomach punch. Jory apologized again and stepped back as the man stood there, stunned. "What are you waiting for, Jory?" he heard Tase shout from the crowd. "Finish him off!" Alora shouted. Jory reluctantly punched the man in the stomach 2 more times, and when he still didn't submit, Jory punched him a final time between the legs. The man fell to his knees and yielded. At the end of the first round, they were allowed a half hour to rest. There were some healers available for those who needed it. "I thought divine magic was illegal in Elnor," Drusilla asked Pernald as they watched a mage heal a nasty-looking broken arm. "Only unregulated divine magic," Pernald answered, then went on to explain that some people were allowed to learn some healing spells and given license to use them in service to the citizens of Elnor. The second round began with the armored Selsun easily beating another smaller, outmatched opponent. Jory's name was called next. A sinking feeling came over him when he heard Alora's name called right after. They stood facing each other in the ring. "You better not try any of those nut shots on me," Alora warned him. "It wasn't my plan," Jory confessed. "What is your plan?" Alora asked as she fired an arrow at him. The crowd gasped as Jory grabbed the arrow before it hit him. "The plan's not to get hit," he answered. He threw the arrow as though it were a javelin, back at Alora, but it sailed past her shoulder. She fired again and Jory pushed the arrow to the side, deflecting it away from him. Jory charged quickly at her and punched her twice below the sternum, hoping to knock the wind out of her, but she was able to shrug off the blows. He quickly ran back to his original spot. He did not have time to get in a defensive stance, and Alora's arrow caught him in the stomach. He tried not to bend over, but did slightly. That's when a second arrow hit him in the crown of his head. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. "Shit, sorry, little guy," Alora said quietly to herself. Jory sat on one side of the Brunch Club while Alora sat on the other. A healer had revived him, but his head was still a little sore, and he had a nasty bump. They waited for the next round to begin. The opponents were announced for the first bout of the semi-final round. The Selsun's name was called first. Alora's was called next. For the first time in his fights, the Selsun did not charge right away. He kept his distance, waiting for Alora to take the first shot. "I like how you handled Loverboy in the first round," he told her. but I don't plan on taking it easy on you." "Same," said Alora, as she shot her first arrow. It bounced harmlessly off the plate armor, leaving behind no more damage than a black scuff mark. She quickly drew and shot another arrow, aiming for underneath the arm where plate mail usually had some weakness, but not this plate mail. Confident in his armor, the Selsun took a few paces towards Alora. She decided on a new tactic, and fired an arrow right for his forehead. The impact of the arrow snapped his head back, and the ringing in his ears made him halt his advance and pause for a moment. Alora fired 3 more arrows, hitting the exact same spot. The Selsun took a step back and shook his head slightly. A clear dent was now visible in the helmet. The crowd grew silent. Whispers rippled through the spectators. This was the first time during the tournament that anyone thought the Selsun might not be invincible. Alora drew her bow back, but the Selsun raised his greatsword horizontally across his head, just high enough so he could still peek under the blade. With the only weak spot she could think of protected, Alora shot for the neck, but her arrow glanced off as well. She cursed as he crouched forward and charged. He was faster than he looked, and she could not evade the giant's sword when he swung it into her side. Her oblique muscles spasmed at the impact, and she felt like she might vomit. She kept her footing and backed away. She fired another arrow, but it missed completely. When she reached for the next shot, she realized with horror that she was out. She saw an arrow just past the Selsun lying on the ground. She lunged for it, but stumbled. He stomped on her hand with one of his large boots, and she gritted her teeth and rolled out of the way. She clutched her hand and flexed it. Nothing seemed broken, but it hurt, and she knew she wouldn't be able to get a good grip on her bowstring. She had placed a wooden short sword in her belt as an emergency. She now held it with 2 hands as she tried to parry another swing, but it was useless defense against the momentum of the giant greatsword. It knocked the short sword out of her hands and caught her in the chest. She staggered back a few feet. She stopped right next to one of her arrows. His swing's momentum had turned the Selsun around. For a brief moment, Alora had a clear shot at the back of his head. She picked up the arrow, fired it, and hoped it would have the same effect as the earlier headshots. The back of the helmet was more rounded than the front, and the arrow glanced off harmlessly. Her wooden short sword lay broken in the dirt. She was out of arrows. She wasn't about to parry the greatsword with her favorite longbow, so she placed it on the ground. Alora raised her hands to yield and bowed respectfully to her opponent. The Selsun nodded at her. From under his helmet, he said, "Well fought, Ranger. That might have gone different if you had real arrows." Alora walked out of the pit to applause deserving a worthy opponent. She got her wounds tended to by the healers and rejoined her friends in the bleachers to watch the rest of the tournament. The armored fighter with the shield who defeated Tase squared off against the Selsun for the championship. The Selsun won easily. They were leaving the bleachers, tired and hungry, and a little depressed about throwing away 30 gold with nothing to show for it, when Captain Pernold called out to them. "Alora, you forgot your prize." When he caught up to them, he informed them Alora had come in third and won 200 gold. Their moods improved as they took the money, thanked him, and continued on to the nearest tavern. The inside of the tavern was a large, single room with several benches and tables. It was crowded, so they took the only open table by the door. At the far end of the tavern were 2 sets of stairs that started at the walls and met in the middle. The kitchen must have been up there because the tavern's waitstaff were constantly running up empty-handed and bringing back food and drinks. "This is the dumbest tavern I have ever seen," commented Drusilla. They all looked at her. It wasn't like their cleric to be so mean. Sure, she teased Vorjan all the time, but it was playful and they had the camaraderie of being divine servants. The hazing she had put Jory through felt cruel, and criticizing the tavern's layout just didn't make sense. "I mean, seriously," she continued, tossing back her glasses of wine. "Who designed this place?" A tap on the shoulder interrupted her. A large, hairy man in sailor's garb looked down. "You know, ma'am, the carpenter worked really hard in this place, and it puts food on the table of its owner and his family. It's not nice to make fun of people trying to earn an honest living," the man said. He didn't mention the dungeon master had 2 minutes to draw out the tavern because that night's game was running late from his players' lack of focus. Drusilla looked at the man, taking in his rough-looking appearance. "What would you know about making an honest living?" she asked in a haughty tone. The man pulled out a short sword. "Not much," he said. "Now give me the halfling." Drusilla noticed the 5 similarly dressed and similarly unpleasant-looking men standing with him. "How much do you want for him?" she asked. Before he could answer, Tase smashed a bottle on the edge of the table. "Now this is my kind of fight," she snarled, and lunged for the closest pirate. The Brunch Club stood in unison and drew their weapons. They rushed at the pirates, who rushed at them. Amidst the chaos of clanging swords and flying fists, Jory felt himself lifted up by the shirt collar and flung over the shoulder of one of the pirates, who ran quickly out the door with him. Jory struggled to break free. He watched the tavern recede in the distance as the pirate ran quickly. Jory began to panic. In a few moments he'd be out of sight of the tavern, and the Brunch Club wouldn't be able to find him. Sadness overcame him when he realized he didn't even know if they would bother looking. Suddenly, his captor stopped, fell face forward, and Jory rolled out of his grasp. He thought the pirate had tripped, but when he looked up he saw Salas standing outside the tavern door. Hands were raised, ready to fire another round of magic missiles if needed. He looked down at the unconscious, possibly dead pirate. The magic missiles would not be needed. Jory thanked Salas when he ran back to her. "Don't mention it," she smiled. The rest of their party joined them outside. Their clothing was ripped, and their hair was a mess. They looked like they'd been in a rough tavern fight. Tase was smiling. "We should probably go," Laura said, glancing back at the door. They took a sharp corner down a side street and walked quickly away from the tavern. "They saw us with Jory. They might be able to find us. We shouldn't go back to the Rampant Wizard," Laura advised. "They might not think to look for us in a fancier inn," Tase said. I know a place in the Courts District. It's fancy, but it's out of the way," Jory told them. "It's called the Victorian Inn." "Looks like you're with us now," Salas said to Jory. "For the night, anyway," muttered Drusilla. Jory frowned. "Don't worry about Drew. She's not mean all the time," Salas assured him. "We should get Jory a disguise," said Tase. "Let's dress him up like a little girl. He'd look cute in a dress and curls," said Drusilla. "I lied. She's actually mean most of the time," Salas shrugged. Jory sighed and led them to the Victorian. Our tale will continue in episode 33. Episode 32 was written by Dominic White and myself, Brian Messmer. The story is based upon my own homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Additional role-playing contributions to the story by Bethany Powers, who plays Diesa, J.P. Black, who plays Drusilla, Liz Chard, who plays Alora, Anna Flemke, who plays Salas, and Dominic White, who plays Jory. Ambience and effects used with permission by Michael Gelfi. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out by sharing it with your friends. We'd appreciate it. More information about Rescued by Dragons and ways to support this podcast can be found at rescuedbydragons.com. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Rescued by Dragons, on Twitter at Rescued Dragons, and on YouTube under Rescued by Dragons. Thank you for listening, and please join me next week to see what my players' choices and the roll of the dice have in store.